Hello, I'm Angie. I'm 76 years old and I've been thinking about something. I think you do a lot of thinking as you get older. Do you ever read a news story or see something happen when you're out and about? Perhaps you meet someone unexpectedly, or perhaps you remember something from years ago. And then you find yourself thinking about it days, months, or even decades later. And there's not anything big that changed the world. And it's not because it appeared in a history book, but because it changed something inside of you. I know I do. In fact, some of the experiences I think about most happened over 60 years ago, and others happened only a few weeks ago. And that has made me wonder, why do some experiences stay with us for the rest of our lives when so many others are forgotten? And perhaps even more importantly, what are they trying to teach us? That question is really the reason this channel exists, and it's been keeping me awake at night. But before we go any further, I suppose I should tell you a little about who I am. My mother came to Britain from Italy after the Second World War. My father was a British soldier. Later, he built a fleet of around 30 taxis that drove on liquid petroleum gas, which in the 60s was quite a rare thing to do. Between my dad and mum, they taught me many of life's lessons, as parents do, of course. But the rest I learned myself. Some through success, I suppose. Some through failure. That hurt, but happens to all of us. Some through work. Some through family. Some through mistakes I would rather not have made. And some through experiences that I still don't completely understand even now. Over the years, I've been many things: a daughter, a wife, a mother, a grandmother, an accountant, an artist, a business owner, a teacher, and more recently, a YouTube creator. I've had periods in my life when things went well. I've had periods when they didn't. I've known happiness. I've known disappointment. I've known confidence, and I've known fear. I've met people I admired enormously, and a few I wish I'd never met. I've learned that life rarely follows the neat little plan that we imagine when we're young. But strangely, that's where many of the best lessons seem to live. These days, I'm also living with multiple myeloma. Now, when people hear that word, they often become uncomfortable. I understand why, but I want to say something important. I don't spend my days thinking about dying. Far from it. I spend my days thinking about living. I fully expect there are many chapters of my life still to be written, many conversations still to be had, and many lessons still to be learned, many mistakes still to enjoy, and many people still to meet. In some ways, being reminded that life is finite makes life feel more precious, not less. It makes me pay attention. It makes me notice things. It makes me appreciate ordinary moments far more than I once did. And perhaps that's another reason for this channel, because the older I get, the more fascinated I become by people. Not famous people, ordinary people. The people we pass every day. The people sitting quietly in cafes. The people carrying worries nobody else can see, The people who smile and the people who don't. The people whose stories we never hear. For example, not long ago, I met an elderly gentleman in Greggs. He sat beside us and we started chatting. One of the first things he told me was that it was his birthday, and that struck me. Out of everything he could have said, that was what he chose. He wanted somebody to share it with, and the reason was because he was all alone over here. Because as we talked, I discovered he had lived in Thailand for many years. He had very little family. He had one close friend who called him every day from Thailand. And as I listened, I found myself thinking about him long after we left, and I still do. Why? What was it about that conversation? Was it loneliness? Was it resilience? Was it aging? Was it the need we all have to be seen? I still don't know, but I've been thinking about it, and that's what this channel is really about. Thinking about things, not in a grand academic way, not in a self-help way, and not because I have answers, but because I think many of us carry experiences that deserve to be examined. Another memory I have came from many years ago. When I was 13, something happened that I still remember vividly today, and I always will, I guess. I've thought about it many times over the years, not because I enjoy remembering it, but because it left fingerprints on my life. And I've come to realise that most people have experiences like that. I'll tell you about that experience in a future video. I'm sure you've had some very meaningful experiences in your life too. A conversation, a loss, a kindness, a betrayal, a moment of fear, a moment of courage. Something that happened decades ago but somehow still lives quietly inside you. Do we ever want to release those memories? Is it possible to release those memories in any way by talking about them? I wonder about that too. You see, life moves on. We all know that. Yet the memory remains. Why? What made it stay? What can it teach us? Those are the questions that interest me now. This channel isn't about having all the answers. In fact, the older I get, the less certain I become about many things. But I do think I've become better at asking questions. Questions about people. And questions about relationships. About loneliness. About regret. About aging. About kindness. Questions about what it means to be human. Sometimes we'll talk about experiences from my own life. Sometimes we'll talk about people I've met. Sometimes we'll talk about something happening in the news. Sometimes we'll talk about things many of us think about but rarely say out loud. And after each story, I want to ask, what might be going on here? What can we learn from this? And what does it tell us about ourselves? I don't want this to be an advice channel. I don't want it to be a counselling channel. I don't want to become an agony aunt. I simply want to be a place where thoughtful people can stop for a while and think about life. Bring a coffee along if it helps. I've got one here today. So, hey ho and cheers to the next chapter, because I suspect many of us are carrying more than we show. A memory, a regret, a fear, a hope, a question, a story. And perhaps talking about these things honestly helps us understand ourselves a little better. In fact, I'm sure about that. One of the things life has taught me is that wisdom rarely arrives through comfort. It usually arrives through difficulty, through mistakes, through disappointment, through uncertainty, through being forced to look honestly at ourselves and the world around us. Those experiences are not always pleasant, but they are often our greatest teachers. So this channel is not an invitation to agree with me, far from it. It's not an invitation to admire me, and far from that as well. And it's certainly not an invitation to see me as an expert. It's simply an invitation to think, to reflect, to wonder, to question, and perhaps to share a little of the road we've travelled, often along the same sort of road, sometimes widely differing. Because the older I get, the more convinced I become that every person has a story worth hearing. And sometimes hidden inside an ordinary story is an extraordinary lesson. So if you've ever had an experience that stayed with you, if you've ever found yourself thinking about something years after it happened, and a lot of the times those things happen when something jogs my memory, either a situation or late at night when I'm just winding down. And quite often they stop me from sleeping and I go over them in my head. Perhaps this sort of thinking will help lay those to rest a bit so they don't disturb my sleep. If you ever wished you had someone to talk things through with, then perhaps you'll feel at home here. I'm Angie, and I'd love you to join me as we try to make a little more sense of this strange, complicated, challenging, beautiful business of being human. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you in the next story. Bye for now.